Be trying to tell us about the fragile line between civilization and oblivion. To understand why Heracleon's discovery shocked the world, you have to understand how long people thought it was fiction. Frank Goddio and his team began surveying Abu Bay using sonar and magnetometers instruments that can detect large buried objects beneath sediment, even in near-zero visibility. What they found beneath the mud, inscribed with a decree from Pharaoh Nectar-Nebo dated to 380 BC outlining tax rules for goods passing through the city's harbor. It's one of the clearest pieces of evidence confirming that Thonis and Heracleion also identified the ruins of Canopus, another sunken city just a few kilometers away, suggesting that it turned out this sunken city was one of the clearest surviving examples of how deeply intertwined Greek and Egyptian culture had become in the ancient world, a single city literally living under two names, two mythologies. Did the survivors go after the final collapse? Some historians believe residents were located to nearby Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great not long before Heracleon's decline, meaning the fall of one great details: gold coins, perfume bottles, children's toys, ritual objects left as offerings to the gods, presumably during ceremonies meant to protect the city from exactly the kind of disaster that eventually an entire civilization can vanish. No dramatic final battle, no written warning, just centuries of gradual sinking, followed by one violent night, and then vibration. Add to that a slow but steady rise in sea levels over the centuries, and Heracleion was essentially sinking from beneath inch by inch, year by year long before anyone realized the danger. But slow decline alone doesn't fully explain the final collapse. In effect, the ground gave way all at once, swallowing streets, harbors, and temples within what may have been just minutes, some remaining still holding cargo, combined with hundreds of stone anchors found scattered across the site. This find alone rewrote what historians understood about ancient Egyptian shipbuilding techniques, revealing. Last time, we told you how an entire Egyptian port city, sacred, wealthy, and once believed to be pure myth, was found sitting on the floor of the Mediterranean, exactly where the old Greek legend said it would be. We covered how it sank, what was found inside it, and why historians spent centuries dismissing it as a fairy tale. But here's the thing about Heracleion. Archaeologists still haven't even come close to finishing the job. By some estimates, less than 5% of this city has actually been excavated, which means almost everything we told you last time was just the surface, literally. In the years since, divers have gone back, and what they found has started rewriting parts of the story all over again: a hidden Greek quarter nobody expected, a ceremonial ship frozen mid-voyage, and a sister city nearby that turned out to be an entire last Roman metropolis in its own right. So if you thought we'd already told you everything about the city Hercules supposedly walked through, you were wrong. Let's go back down. Since Heracleon's rediscovery in 2000, the same French-led underwater archaeology team has returned to Abu Bay nearly every year, using sonar, magnetometers, and manual excavation to map the site meter by meter. And after 2.5 decades of work, the team's own lead researcher has estimated that only about 5% of the ancient city has actually been uncovered. 5%. After 25 years. Part of the problem is depth of burial. Some sections of the city sit under several meters of hardened clay and sediment, which has to be removed by hand or with gentle suction equipment to avoid damaging anything underneath. Part of it is simple scale. The research zone covers an area of roughly 11 by 15 kilometers of open bay, and the city itself may have sprawled across a significant portion of that. And part of it is that every single season, the team finds something that changes the shape of the map. New canals, new foundations, new evidence that the city extended further than anyone previously assumed, which raises an unsettling possibility. Everything we covered in part 1, the temple, the statues, the shipwrecks, might genuinely just be the introduction. And in this next section, you'll see exactly what that means, because some of the biggest discoveries at Heracleion didn't happen back in 2000. They happened in just the last 2 or 3 years, starting in 2023 and continuing through the following 2 excavation seasons. Divers working east of the main Amun temple complex uncovered something nobody had confirmed before: a dedicated sanctuary to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, sitting right in the middle of what had always been assumed to be a purely Egyptian religious district. Alongside the shrine, the team found something even more unexpected: a collection of ancient Greek weapons, spearheads, blades, military equipment consistent with mercenary soldiers, strongly suggesting the presence of an actual Greek garrison stationed inside the city, likely tasked with defending Egypt's most important harbor during the Said dynasty, roughly the 7th to 6th century BC. This matters more than it might seem. For decades, historians assumed Greek involvement in Egypt was mostly limited to trade merchants passing through, doing business, and leaving. But a permanent religious shrine, combined with a military garrison, tells a very different story. Greek settlers weren't just visiting Heracleion. They were living there, worshipping there, defending it as their own. It suggests Heracleion wasn't simply an Egyptian city that happened to trade with Greeks. It may have been one of the earliest genuine melting pots in the ancient Mediterranean, centuries before Alexandria would later become famous for exactly that same kind of cultural fusion. In a strange way, Heracleion may have been quietly rehearsing Alexandria's future, right up until the moment it sank. Among the more than 100 shipwrecks now catalogued at the site, one stands out: a long ceremonial barge, over 13 meters in length, its wooden hull preserved well enough that researchers could study its construction technique in detail. This wasn't an ordinary cargo vessel. Its design suggests it was used for religious processions, the kind of ship that would carry statues of gods along the city's canals during festivals, watched by crowds lining the waterways. Its construction technique also solved a long-standing historical puzzle. The Greek historian Herodotus had described a distinctive Egyptian shipbuilding method, one so unusual that many later scholars assumed he'd simply gotten the details wrong, or was describing something exaggerated. When archaeologists studied this barge's hull, they found the exact building technique Herodotus described, nearly 20 centuries after he wrote about it. It's a rare moment in archaeology proof, buried in mud for over 2,000 years, that an ancient historian everyone had quietly doubted had actually gotten it right all along. Heracleion wasn't alone down there. A few kilometers away sits Canopus, a city ancient writers described as a resort town, known for temples, festivals, and a reputation for indulgence. For years, only fragments of Canopus had been mapped. That changed with a 2025 survey, which revealed something researchers are now calling a nearly complete Roman-era city footprint: temples, water cisterns, harbor quays, and even fish tanks, all still largely intact beneath the sediment. Unlike Heracleion, which sank primarily during its late period, Canopus appears to have continued being inhabited and rebuilt well into the Roman era, meaning its ruins capture a different, later chapter of this coastline's slow disappearance into the sea. Put the two sites together, and a bigger picture starts to emerge. This wasn't just one unlucky city that happened to sink. This entire stretch of coastline was once a dense, interconnected network of ports, temples, and towns, and all of it eventually met the same fate. Which makes you wonder exactly how much more of this ancient coastline is still sitting out there, simply waiting to be mapped. Now, it's worth addressing something directly, because it comes up constantly in the comments of videos like this one. Is Heracleion secretly connected to Atlantis? Short answer: no, and the actual story is arguably more interesting than the myth. Atlantis originates from a single source, the Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 360 BC, in what most historians consider an allegorical story meant to illustrate a philosophical point, not a historical record. No inscriptions, no artifacts, no independent ancient sources describe Atlantis as a real place. Heracleion is the opposite case entirely. It's described by multiple independent ancient writers, referenced in inscriptions on stone found at the actual site, confirmed through physical excavation, and dated using consistent archaeological methods. It didn't require imagination to find. It required sonar, patience, and about 4 years of systematic seafloor mapping. That distinction matters, because it's easy to lump every lost city story into the same mythical bucket, but Heracleion is proof that some of these stories aren't myths stretched into legend. They're just real history that got buried a little too well, for a little too long. The real mystery here was never whether Heracleion existed. It's how something this significant managed to stay hidden for over 1,000 years, right off the coast of one of the most heavily studied countries in the ancient world. For most of the past 2 decades, Heracleion's treasures existed almost entirely out of public reach, locked behind the practical reality that the site itself is too fragile and too remote for casual visitors. No diving tours, no public access, just researchers, cameras, and a handful of traveling exhibitions. That changed significantly with the opening of Egypt's Grand Egyptian Museum in late 2025. Which now displays recovered pieces from Heracleion and canopus to a global audience on a scale the artifacts had never reached before. It's a strange kind of full circle moment. Statues that once stood watch over a thriving ancient port, then spent over 1,000 years buried in total darkness at the bottom of the sea, are now standing under gallery lighting, watched by a completely different kind of crowd. And with roughly 95% of the city still unexcavated, this is very likely just the first wave of what eventually ends up on display. Whatever museum exhibit exists on Heracleion right now is, statistically speaking, only a small preview of a much bigger story still buried offshore. We touched on this in part 1, but it deserves a second look, because the more researchers learn about exactly how Heracleion sank, the more relevant it starts to feel. The city's downfall wasn't one single event. It was a slow combination of factors: soft, waterlogged delta soil gradually settling under the city's own weight, sea levels rising over centuries, and then a sudden seismic event that finished the process almost overnight. Individually, none of those factors seemed urgent while they were happening. Together, they were fatal. Modern researchers studying coastal delta cities today point to the exact same combination of risk factors: soft ground, rising seas, seismic activity as an active concern for several major cities built in similar geological conditions around the world right now. Heracleion isn't a warning that arrived in time to help the people who live there, but it might be one of the clearest physical warnings we have for the people living in similar places today. So where does that leave us? With a city that's already rewritten Mediterranean history once when it was rediscovered at all. And again every time a new excavation season peels back another layer we didn't know was there. We still don't know exactly how many people lived in Heracleion at its peak. We still don't know the full extent of the Greek quarter, or whether more sanctuaries like Aphrodite's are waiting somewhere in the unexcavated 95%. And we still don't have a complete answer for why, after centuries of steady warning signs, nobody moved the city before it was too late. What we do know is that every single year, someone goes back down there and finds something that changes the story a little more, which means, in a very real sense, this isn't a finished mystery. It's an ongoing one, and one of the very few lost city stories where the next chapter genuinely hasn't been written yet. If you want to see where the story goes next whenever this year's excavation season wraps up, subscribe, because we'll be the ones covering it. And let me know in the comments, now that you know Heracleion is real, which other myth do you think we should go digging into next?